It's a pleasure to moderate this discussion, particularly with a group of experts, some of them I know from before. My role today is just to moderate and introduce the experts, and I will let them talk. We have a total of 1 hour and 15 minutes, and the way we are going to organize the session is we will have 15 minutes for each participant to make their presentation, and we will have around 30 minutes time for the discussion. It's a nice segue. I just want to reflect the morning session that there's three key things in my head after coming out of the morning sessions, where we heard from a colleague from the World Bank on power of targeting, and particularly when the resources are scarce, knowing where the poor are and reaching them, and it becomes important from the equity perspective as well. We also heard from colleagues the issues and challenges in targeting, particularly the exclusion errors and the effectiveness of programs. And I think the third important point in my brain is the trade-offs. What are the trade-offs that we are looking at in terms of the adequacy of the benefits versus universalism spreading thinly? So with those three things in mind, my hope is that we'll get some, if not all, answers to these questions from the three presenters that we have. Let me quickly introduce the panelists. We have Ugo Gentilini, who is the senior economist, and soon he will be joining the global lead for social assistance in the World Bank. I know Ugo from before, and we met a couple of times in the corridors of World Bank. So welcome, Ugo. We have Jamele Rigolini, who will be presenting together with Ugo. He is a lead economist and program leader for Western Balkans Human Development World Bank. We have Martin Evans, a former colleague of mine from UNICEF. Martin has joined Overseas Development Institute now as a senior research fellow. And we have Eszter Timár, that I met first time. It's a really pleasure to meet you, Eszter. And she'll be talking about, she's a researcher on social protection from Maastricht Graduate School of Governance, United Nations University. The way we have structured the session is that we'll go hear first from Ugo and Jamele about UBI and its potential impact on child well-being. Then we will hear from Martin Evans about middle-income countries UCG analysis, and then we'll go to a more country-specific case from Eszter. So without further ado, over to Ugo.
Thank you very much. And one reason for starting with me is that UBI was raised in the previous session. So perhaps it's a good way of picking up on some of the threads. I will offer some reflections, and then also Jamele will go into some of the results from some new simulations that we are conducting. And let me see if in my case it works. Yeah, so one interesting thing in reading a lot about UBI and being part of the discussion, a fascinating issue is that people with very different views about the role of the state in general and about the role of social protection come up in support of UBI. So you may have, on one hand, Milton Friedman, who deliberately said that a program that was similar to a UBI would be a Trojan horse for rolling back the state. And on the other hand, you have a very interesting discussion around how to align UBI with the social protection floors initiatives. So you have really some views supporting UBI to shrink the role of the state in providing social protection, and others that actually see exactly the opposite. And okay. And one other thing that was raised by David before is that is there a shared understanding about what the UBI actually is? And here we're offering just a basic illustration. And imagine it as the alignment of three design choices, being completely universal, being entirely unconditional, and being entirely cash-based. So in that sense, it differs a little bit from child grants, in that the child grants are categorical. So they oftentimes sound similar and look similar, but they're actually quite different. Plus, there are a number of other design features that make UBI peculiar, including the fact that it's provided to individuals, for example, and not households. We also heard a lot about, even if you look at the blogosphere, on Twitter, the excitement about the idea, and that there are so many pilots and initiatives out there. We counted 22 pilots and about 29 policy proposals about the idea. And, but when you dig a little bit deeper and you see in how many cases really those three design choices that I showed come out together at national level, how many countries really had a UBI? Well, actually, it's not 0, it's 1. And the only country that had a UBI in place is Mongolia. It had it for 2 years. And the beautiful conference paper on universal child grants really describes the ups and downs of universal child grants in detail, but it's also interesting that there was a little window within which a real UBI was actually implemented and then scaled back in 2012. And another amazing feature is that I only found one paper that discussed that experience, a paper published in 2015. So compared to universal child grants present in 21 countries in pure form and in 14 in quasi form, is rather limited. So what we're trying also to do with a number of colleagues, many of whom are here in the room, Jürgen is one, and Jamele, of course, and Franziska, Basagli, is to put together a volume that tries to look at UBI at 360 degrees. What are the design choices? What's the experience? What are the financial implications? What's the political economy behind it, the design choices? And a book that hopefully will come out this spring is still in draft form. And just to give you a sense of some of the issues that we cover, is that it's not going to be the book that is going to come out pro or against UBI, but it offers a framework to think about those issues. And possibly, it's often a dichotomy, right? Are you pro-UBI or are you against UBI? We instead try to weave that discussion into the broader conversation on how you achieve universal social protection. There are many trajectories. UBI is somewhat a shortcut to it. You achieve it with one program in one go. But you can also do it pursuing universality through the combination of different social assistance programs, combinations with insurance-based models. So trying to weave the conversation on UBI around that. Another important issue that we cover is taxation. And oftentimes, and we heard also from the previous panel, that on one hand, you give it to everyone. And on the other hand, you take it back from some. So especially when financed through progressive taxation, UBI ends up being an intervention targeted via taxes. And all the trade-offs that we always talk about, how much to provide in terms of adequacy, how many people to reach, what are the incentive effects, what are the cost effects, all these are amplified, all this discussion with the UBI that is really at national level. And there are clear distributional effects. Some gain from that reform, some lose. And I'd like just to turn very quickly to Jamele to actually quantify some of these gains and losses across different parts of the population.
So So, sorry, I'm getting familiar with IT, and then it's this
The big button.
Okay.
No, the one below.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what we did, and what we're going to see here are results for universal basic income, a flat transfer given to everyone, actually adult only in these simulations. But I think many of the points and the issues that have been raised for universal child grants are reflected here. So the thinking is pretty much the same. And what we did is for 10 countries, ranging from low to middle to high income across the world, we simulated what would happen if we would replace selected non-contributory social assistance cash transfers, such as child grants, CCTs, social pensions, other benefits but cash, with a UBI, a flat transfer UBI. What would happen? And here we see in the first graph the impacts on poverty. And the interesting part is that what we find is that apart from one country, in all other 9 countries, the current systems are better at reducing poverty than a budget-neutral UBI reform. And this is very simple. The current system, as we have seen, have huge mistakes in terms of significant, not all huge, but varying degrees of mistakes in terms of including the poor, excluding the rich. They're not perfect, but overall, they tend to give a little bit more resources to the poor than to the non-poor. So if you reform your programs and implement a UBI, what you would observe would be that the UBI takes away some resources from the poor and give it to the non-poor. That's why a UBI is less effective at reducing poverty. Now, as the lone example where a UBI would be more effective in reducing poverty shows is it really depends on the programs you substitute. There are countries with a lot of categorical programs that don't go to the poor. And if you would use these programs to actually finance a UBI, if you would reform these programs, then yes, you may actually get a higher poverty impact. Okay. So, and that's confirmed by the graph we have here that basically shows that the more resources in the existing system go to the poor, in spite of all the imperfections they have, the more the current systems are better than a UBI at reducing poverty. So, in a sense, there is a clear trade-off when you think about reform, about how well already current systems are good at reducing poverty. And one thing that is often underlooked is that any reform has distributional implications. And what we did in our simulation is look at who wins and who loses from budget-neutral UBI reforms. And clearly that depends on the program that were existing. If you take a program for children, most likely children would suffer. If you replace social pensions, the elderly may suffer. But what was interesting here, that in all 10 countries, and results are going to come out soon, possibly with names, in all 10 countries, we found consistently people across all ages, all income categories, to be winning and losing. So it's incredible how this reform will have deep distributional implication within categories. We will not be able to say, oh, the reform favors children. No, within children, there will be people benefiting and people suffering from it. Now, one of the limitations of our study until there was that we were taking programs and replacing it. And of course, part of the discussion is to have a more generous UBI. And there are few emerging points emerge. The first one is clearly a more generous UBI would have deeper impacts on poverty. Now, we kind of calculated the costs of a UBI that would allow not to entirely reduce poverty, but to give to everybody kind of the average poverty gap, the distance of the poor, the average distance of the poor from the poverty line, which is a meaningful impact on poverty. And one interesting result was the cost. In many low-income countries, these costs are just prohibitively expensive. We're speaking about 10 to up to 20% of GDP, depending how generous you are. So in countries with constrained fiscal situations, it may be very difficult to implement a UBI. The interesting part is when you move to middle-income countries, then a UBI becomes somewhat more affordable, also because the tax system is more developed and you can start taxing more people. So we have a few countries, and actually we've been discussing with clients, where ultimately whether to go UBI or not is a political decision. But our role in this study is to show the clear trade-offs you have between a UBI and other solutions. And one trade-off we find, even in middle-income country, with respect to a very substantial UBI, is the political economy challenge. So working with Nora Lustig from the Commitment to Equity Institute, we calculated how much taxation would need to increase on the top 10% of the population to finance a UBI with a meaningful impact on poverty. And we actually found that taxation, direct taxation, indirect taxation should easily increase by 10 percentage points. So that doesn't mean it's not feasible, and that's actually, taxation is also one of the main instruments of redistribution. So in highly unequal countries, you may actually want to tax some of the richest people, but just from a political economy perspective, financing a very generous UBI will create challenges because the richest people will need to contribute a substantial amount. Finally, two final slides. Sorry. Two final slides on children. There is a big discussion whether a UBI should include or not include children. And we have the perspective that if you do a UBI, it may actually, you really need to be careful about that question, because poorer families tend to have more children, and actually many current programs are focused on children, whether universal or targeted. So if you reform your UBI and you don't give it to children, you actually will have significantly lower impacts on reducing child poverty. And the second point we have is, we did, in the context of our dialogue, simulation of really child grants reforms in a middle-income country. And I think we do find most of what we discussed for UBI holds for universal child grants. The scale is different, the numbers are different, but the trade-offs are the same. And one trade-off that we really would like to put attention is, being universal versus being adequacy versus coverage. Do you really need to cover everybody and then versus giving more to the poor? In that specific countries, keeping the child grant as it is now, but expanding to everybody, would add 1.5% of GDP to the current cost. And actually, if you limit the transfer, even with mistakes, to people who are to not all the population, but a subset of the population, and be more generous with your transfer, then you could get a much higher impact on poverty with actually a lower fiscal cost. So that doesn't mean universality is not the solution, but it means, poverty is only one objective of a universal transfer, but it means all this trade-off, adequacy, and need to be taken in consideration when thinking about which transfer to do. Ultimately, I agree with what Margaret Gross said. Countries have different paths towards universality, and I think what we are doing more increasingly at the World Bank is to assist countries in the path they have chosen themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, you go on, Jamele, for this very insightful and interesting presentation. Without further delay, over to you, Martin.
Hi, thank you.
Your presentation?
Where is it?
Here.
Okay. I'm going to present a very summary form of paper that we wrote over 2 years ago now. It's joint work with Alejandra Hidalgo and Mei Wang, who were both interns. So this is somewhat an advert for free labor, I'm afraid. It's already published on the Luxembourg Income Study website. And I do advise you to read the paper because we cover a lot more ground, both in terms of looking at which children are poor and why, and also on different iterations of universal child transfers. But we were approaching it in a way which was scoping rather than really deliberative or prescriptive. We wanted to know, in the countries that we could see in the Luxembourg Income Study database that were new to that database. LIS has been around since the mid-80s, but originally only covered high-income countries. And then 10 years ago, they began to expand into middle-income countries. And we now have about 17, I think. We chose 14. We didn't choose countries which already had established universal child grants of scale. And what we wanted to do is say, are there similar aspects to where children are in the income distribution, and how could universal cash grants be designed to both cover every child, but also to counter child poverty? Which one is it?
The big one.
The big one.
You need to raise your arm.
Oh,
yes.
There we go. But before I get on to detail, let's just do some reminders if you haven't seen this evidence before. If we think of the global picture, this graph shows along the x-axis per capita monetary welfare in purchasing power parity 2011. And on the Y scale, it shows the percentage of the population. And the black line is the proportion of adults at every income level, and the other lines are proportions of children. For those of you who do statistics, this is a cumulative density function. But the important thing is if you read along the bottom axis, $1.90, which is the lowest SDG target for poverty, you'll see far larger proportions of children of any age than adults. But as you go up the income scale, that difference maintains. So children seem to be in a position across the income distribution of having lower income. So it ain't just a problem of poverty, it's a problem across the whole distribution. And that's why I think a universal approach attracted us to try and test to see how we could reconcile and look at those trade-offs. And for the rest of what we do today, I'm only going to look at simple arithmetic outcomes. But one interesting question that we pursued in a different paper, just in 5 middle-income countries, is to ask whether those differences at every quintile were actually due to the presence of children or to other factors. So we did something a bit posh called a quintile regression, and we show there that the coefficients for the presence of children show negative, significant levels of association at every quintile in all 5 countries. So there is something inherent in the income distribution that penalizes children, not just in terms of poverty, but their position across the whole distribution. And because I was coming on after Ugo, I thought, aha, one thing I have to address is the fact that we're measuring poverty at the household level, and therefore demographics really do determine what happens in terms of distributional outcomes. So this is more recent work done at the ODI, where we just took a sample of 16 countries. It was not a representative sample, it's just where we had data. But we tried to line them up from left to right in terms of economic development status, but in this graph, it's actually on the proportion of the population that are children. And the big thing to remember when you're measuring poverty outcomes for child allowances is that children live with other people. I know that's difficult for some people to reckon because all of our advocacy is about children, not about their adult co-residents. But it really, really matters when you're looking at the impact of a cash grant. Because here we show the left-hand side on Madagascar, which has 53% of its population of children, but 82% of households contain children. And more than that, 92% of the population live in those households with children. So if you have a universal approach, which on a fixed budget produces a much smaller amounts of benefit because you're spreading it across a wide sector of the population. If you're doing that for children, there is a big indirect targeting output. And that outcome is basically a dilution of the poverty effect according to co-residence and household size. So in Madagascar, we see that, yes, I mean, it would go to, a universal child grant would effectively go to 92% of the population. As we go down, we see that, in the high-income countries, that ratio is far smaller. So you have better implicit targeting towards children as a discrete group, and also that something I won't show here, but the distributional position of children actually becomes more unequal as you go up the development spectrum. But let's go back to our 14 countries. And the first thing we did was to say, where are children in the income distribution? For all of these calculations, we use per capita net disposable income. But clearly, across all 14 countries, and these are just the sample of what we can see, they're not representative, we have over-representation of children in the bottom quintile and in the bottom 40%. So if everything was equal, you would expect 20% of kids to live in the bottom 20%. But things ain't equal, and you'll see that I can't read those numbers, you probably can't as well, but in Uruguay, we're getting nearer to 30% of kids that live in the bottom 20%. More? What is it? 36%, thank you. Even with glasses, it doesn't work. While in other countries, that may be more than 20%, but it's still an over-representation at the bottom of the distribution. So, how can you design a universal child grant to go to all children and at the same time optimize poverty reduction? So we did simple arithmetic static simulations, micro-simulations using the survey data in Luxembourg Income Survey. And we said we've got to have a constant budget across our 14 countries. So we chose 1% of GDP. It's a new spend. We're not creating any losers. We're just looking at how to design universal child benefits to spend that money in a way which can look at the universal versus poverty trade-off. We use a constant poverty line, which is 50% of median per capita disposable household income. Please remember that this isn't an absolute line, and that in some of these middle-income countries, the median person may well have living standards which are absolutely poor. But what we're going to do is examine three things. Whether giving allowance to a household with children, i.e. we divide 1% of GDP by the number of households that have children, produces a different result than if we divide 1% of GDP by the number of children. We're then going to say, well, yes, within a universal approach, we can still weight allowances to different ages of children. So all children aged 0 to 17 would get something, but younger children would get more in our simulations. And then we said, well, okay, what can we do to weight allowances to the bottom 40? These are middle-income countries. They do not all have advanced and stable tax systems, but if we can tax back universal child allowances, can we use the savings in our budget to optimize our 1% of GDP towards the bottom 40%? So this is what we're going to do. So my result one looks at all the countries. So they're China, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Egypt, Georgia, Guatemala, India, Mexico, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, Russia, Serbia, and Uruguay. And I'm not going to show you the first run because I have limited time. Our first run did that first iteration where we just gave every household with children their share of the new budget. And that produced poverty effects. What I'm going to do is, what this slide does, is show what the additional poverty reduction was by giving it to per capita children. So if you move from giving it to all households to an allowance which is paid for each child, you'll see a big green line and across every country with a proportional reduction in poverty attached to it. And that's because the dark green means it's a significant result of a difference to our original simulation. And what we see in every one of these 14 countries is that you get more poverty reduction if you pay universal child allowances for every child rather than just to households with children. Our result two is what happens when we change the assumption and give higher amounts to younger children. And here we have significant results for different forms of that simulation. The dark red means it's a significant difference. The light pink means it's within 1 percentage point poverty difference, which I said was my implicit measure without going into every survey and looking at confidence intervals. That was my way of saying it's not as robust as the others. But what we see is actually giving more money to younger children doesn't actually improve your poverty impact compared to giving it to all children at the same rate. The reason for that I found odd, because when we did our poverty profiling, younger children were always poorer. But remember, children live with other people, and children live with other children. And what you're giving away, what you're giving to your young children, you're taking away from their older peers, and the net result doesn't give you a bigger poverty impact. But when we reran this result, and I won't show you the results, when we said let's spend all our money on the 0 to 3s or the 0 to 5s, we did get improved poverty results in a few countries. So our final approach is to say let's weight individual allowances for each child. We're going to give the bottom 40 a higher proportion of the spend than they would have through their population size. But that means children in the higher 60% of the distribution get less. I'm still calling that universal because I can. And the result from that, compared to our original results, again, is to say yes, in many countries this has a much bigger impact on poverty yet again than our original simulation based on individual allowances. So what conclusions? I mean, this is not a representative set of countries. They are all countries which have income as a welfare measure. And I think the difference between consumption and income measures matter a lot in terms of the effect of transfers. But so they're not representative, but they are of a size and of a distribution from India up to Uruguay to be sort of illustrative at least. So it is possible to design a universal child grant to optimize their poverty impact. And that is based on my understanding of universal approaches. If there are people who say you have to treat every child the same by age or where they are, then obviously it falls foul of that. But the second point is that age differentials may not work. Yeah, they may work if you target your whole budget to them, but if you're giving more to some kids and less to others, the aggregate effect may not give you better poverty outcomes. But it is clear that giving individual level allowances works better than allocating your budget to each household with children. And that's simple arithmetic, and I stand by that, unless someone can shoot me down in flames. Is there a way of weighting universal child grants to the lowest part of the distribution? Because that works even better. But how do you do that? With countries with advanced income tax systems, we can tax it back, but income tax is weak outside of high-income countries. Other approaches of reducing the allowance may work. PMTs may work because it's a large population rather than a small population of poor that you're trying to target. So the averaging exclusion errors will be less. But, you know, mixing PMT with UCGs may send some people running from the room with their hands in the air screaming that it's just not right. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Over to you, Eszter.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here today. And I've heard that the case of Kyrgyzstan has received a lot of attention lately, so I'm hoping to be able to contribute to this discussion. I'm also very happy to see that we have a big delegation from the Kyrgyz government here, so welcome to all of you. A little bit about the background. Now, Kyrgyzstan has a relatively comprehensive social protection system, and part of this system is a means-tested social assistance transfer for families with children called the MBPF. This benefit has been in place for 2 decades now, with many minor reforms to its design and implementation over time. In 2017, members of the parliament has decided to replace this transfer by a new law which includes a more inclusive package of benefits, expecting that this would ensure that all children in need are reached. This package was supposed to consist of a lump sum birth allowance for all newborns, a categorical child grant for all children until the age of 3, and another categorical child grant for older children that live in a household with 3 or more children. Now, initially, there seemed to be a very strong political support behind this proposal. In fact, it was accepted in the parliament. The budget was even prepared and accepted for it, and it was supposed to be implemented starting in 2018. However, following quite some public and political turmoil, including conflicting advice from development partners, the reform did not end up being implemented, with the exception of the lump sum birth allowance. So the question is, what now? The MBPF is almost back to square one. Yes, the birth grant remained, and some small adjustments were also introduced to the mean test and the program implementation. What the objective of these reforms were and what the impacts will be, we will have to see with time. But nonetheless, the MBPF is still characterized by very low coverage and benefit adequacy, and it achieves very little reduction of child poverty. This is partially linked to the fact that the government has traditionally been trying to focus on inclusion errors and to limit the number of beneficiaries. Still, many people feel that there is still a need and a momentum for further changes to the targeting of the MBPF, which calls for a careful consideration of what are alternatives and what is actually feasible in the context of Kyrgyzstan. To do so, on the one hand, we applied static microsimulation models to representative household survey, where we looked at the costs and the distributional impacts of various targeting options. But these numbers, they can tell us only so much about what is actually feasible in the context, which is why we also did some key informant interviews with a range of national and international stakeholders who are somehow involved in social protection. A fiscal space analysis is also going to complement our findings, but this is still underway, so it is not covered in this presentation. One thing that is very clear from the literature is that there is no silver bullet that would work for every context and every program. So first, the objective of the program matters tremendously. Policymakers will also have to make decisions about the big trade-offs of social protection, for example, if they tolerate inclusion or exclusion errors more, or if they wish to expand coverage or adequacy. These preferences also depend on the objectives of the policy. There are many other factors of the local context that have implications for targeting, for example, the political economy, societal preferences for redistribution, attitudes towards the poor, the country's poverty profile, demographics, the economic context, and the social sector's administrative and technical capacity. I would like to briefly explain a few economic and social characteristics of the country that have far-reaching implications for targeting. First, the informal sector in the country is very large. The ADB estimated it to be somewhere between 25% to 80% of the economy. Moreover, Kyrgyz households rely very heavily on remittances. Now, these two factors, they do not only mean that incomes are difficult to measure, it also limits the wiggle room that the government has to increase fiscal space via taxation of labor and firms. There has been a very stark decrease in poverty over the last decades if we look at the international standards. But measured at the national poverty line, actually there seems to be persistent poverty. Around 25% of the population is poor. And children are affected disproportionately by poverty. As you can see on the graph, children below 6 have a 37% of poverty rate. Household size and the number of children is also heavily correlated with poverty. At the same time, the demographics of the country call for investing in children. The population is rather young now, but it is expected to age in the coming decades. Now, this can either be seen as a challenge or a window of opportunity to invest in children. In such a context, it is also strategically important not to leave any child behind. This graph on the right side, I think, is quite a good illustration of both the low levels of political support for the MBPF and also some implementation errors. The blue line is the GMI, the Guaranteed Minimum Income. Now, this is a standard that guides both the value of the benefit and the threshold for eligibility. So households are eligible if their per capita income is below the GMI. Logically, as the GMI increases, one would expect the number of beneficiaries to increase because there are more people eligible. But as you can see on the green line, which represents the number of beneficiaries, the exact opposite has happened. This shows a very strong downward pressure on the budget for the program and efforts to limit the number of beneficiaries. There also seems to be a weak political backwind of the program. Perhaps it's because the program targets precisely those who have very little political voice. In discussions with key informants, it also became apparent that there is no clear vision on the objectives of the MBPF, neither among the public or policymakers, which further weakens its support. From a technical perspective, one of the key obstacles of targeting is that it is very difficult to assess family income in Kyrgyzstan. The mean test looks at administrative income. This includes basically every sort of income that is visible to the state, but remittances or wages earned in the informal economy are not part of this, unless applicants decide to state them. A practical example is of this is the share of the people that fall below the GMI, the eligibility threshold. If we look at income, there is only 1.8% of the people who live below the GMI. If we look at consumption, in the household survey at least, there are 0 observations. But at the same time, almost 9% is covered by the MBPF. This is exactly because there is a huge difference between what we call administrative income and between total income. Now, at the same time, the application process is very complicated and costly, which excludes exactly those who are the most vulnerable. To top all of these issues, there is quite substantial corruption reported in the targeting process. And as a result of all of this, many of the extreme poor are excluded, and many relatively better off households are included in the program. As a matter of fact, 2 out of 3 extremely poor children do not receive support from the state. Now, if we assume that the objectives of the program are to protect and to invest in children, one can argue that exclusion errors should be of particular concern because they are both ethically unacceptable, but they also undermine the overall objectives of the policy, while inclusion errors, one could argue, are only a waste of resources. Now, this table gives an overview of some of the options we have simulated. So as you can see, we included some very inclusive options, such as providing benefits to all children until they turn 16, or all children until they reach 16, except for the wealthiest quintile. We have also replicated the law of 2017, made an adjustment to the law of 2017 where no old beneficiaries would be removed, and we also isolated a categorical child allowance for children under 3. Now there is a broad range of indicators that we can use to evaluate the distributional impacts of alternative options, but for simplicity, here we only look at exclusion errors and the poverty gap reduction. Now, the MBPF in its 2016 form excluded a massive share of extremely poor and poor children. And whatever alternative we look at, we see that the exclusion of poor children is only a fraction of that. Bear in mind for this that for the categorical grants, we assume perfect implementation and full take-up. That is, of course, a best-case scenario because, for example, a lot of children in Kyrgyzstan don't have birth certificates, which is quite a substantial barrier for them to access transfers. If we look at the reduction of the child poverty, we also see that alternatives outperform the MBPF, albeit to a varying extent. Now, the broadest options would require upscaling that might be prohibitive, around 4 or 5% of GDP, but starting with extending coverage for the smallest children should be a possibility within reason. A categorical grant for children under 3, for example, would cost only about 0.8% of GDP, which is not much higher than the current MBPF expenditure of approximately 0.5% of GDP. Combinations of this child grant and a transfer for older children would be possible between 1–2% of GDP, depending on the design. But in any case, if protecting and investing in children is to be taken seriously, it will inevitably be costly. So now we come to the point that we hear a lot, is that funding is generated by political will. But where does political will come from? This is where our interviews become quite important. Policymakers' perceptions on the role and objectives of transfers will influence their commitment to the cause. Our respondents said that they view the MBPF as a transfer to protect the well-being of children and also to ensure that they have equal opportunities to develop. However, interestingly, most of them also said that while they have this view, they feel like other people have a different perception of the MBPF, many seeing it as simply a transfer for the poor, and that the attitudes towards the poor are very negative. They deem them undeserving. Regarding financial feasibility, we have heard very conflicting views. Some thought that it is unrealistic for the budget for child benefits to be scaled up substantially, while others thought that The passing of the law of 2017 and preparing the budget for it was by itself proof that there is fiscal space if there is political will. We also asked respondents about their opinions about the role of the government in providing protection, where the principle of subsidiarity was cited quite heavily, but at the same time, respondents did see an important role of cash transfers provided by the central government when it comes to children. And lastly, from a technical point of view, administrative feasibility, most respondents mentioned that there are shortcomings and challenges of the means test. However, there was actually no consensus on whether exclusion or inclusion errors are the greater issue. So taking all of this into account, it is rather clear that a categorical child grant would be a sensible choice in Kyrgyzstan. They would reduce the administrative burdens, the risk of corruption, reduce the exclusion of poor children, and it would also help the government prepare for the coming demographic challenge by investing in its youngest generation. It can also be argued, some would argue this, that extending the coverage of the program would eventually garner enough political and public support to increase the benefit values, which could ease the trade-off between coverage and adequacy in the long term. Interestingly, in terms of public and political popularity, respondents felt that affluence testing, which was the option where we excluded only the wealthiest of the population, would be much more feasible than purely universal or categorical selection, because it would silence the voices that are asking why should the rich benefit? Now, according to our interviews, an opportunity for further reform is likely. But how do we secure political will? Choosing an approach to target child benefits will ultimately have to be the choice of the Kyrgyz people and Kyrgyz policymakers. I think that the international community, development partners, practitioners, researchers, they have an important role in advising the government. But after what we have seen in the last few years in Kyrgyzstan, a very important question at this point is whether they will be able to present a united front and a united position in advising the government. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eszter, for that interesting country example from Kyrgyzstan. Colleagues, we have roughly 22 minutes for question and answers. So please feel free to open your mic and ask questions. In the first round, we'll take 2-3 questions, and then if there are more questions, we'll take another round of questions.
Thank you, Atif, and thanks all the panelists. Very cutting edge, I should say, research, certainly on UBI, and Martin, what you presented from the Luxembourg income study. And what I would say is a lot of it is arithmetic, and I think I'm glad you kept on saying that. It's a choice between how big is the denominator and how fixed you want to keep the numerator. But obviously, what we are struggling here in the countries that we're working in is not a choice of mathematics, right? It's a very different kind of challenges that we're facing. It's more of design and implementation and political will. So if we were designing a program completely in vacuum, devoid of the considerations for political economy and the challenges of targeting, then I'll go with you. If you're at all suggesting that targeting approaches lead to better results for poverty reduction, then I will go down that road, because I could actually very efficiently identify those households which are the poorest, and there are no other challenges of political will, political economy, political support for the program. But the reality is very different. The reality is, as for example in Nepal, 70 to 80% of the population is lying very close to the construction of the poverty line. And I would say poverty line ultimately is a construct, minus 5 percentage points up and down. So if that is your poverty plus huddling poverty, you're immediately dealing with the challenges of targeting. And hence we have seen targeting not working in so many contexts. Type 1 and type 2 errors being very high in most of the programs that we have seen around. That's one. Second, then, you're talking about political will. I think if there was no opposition to targeted approaches, I completely understand we could go down that route. But the reality is very different. The question that I have is this. For a country like Nepal, where 70 to 80% population is very close to poverty line, where fiscal space is limited, and we are not talking of a rich cash transfer program. So let's not compare apples and oranges. For example, in UK, the child benefit program is very rich. In Nepal, we are talking about $4 per child to a limit of 2 children per month. A very poor program, but still very important transfers for those households. So for a country like Nepal, what are those design implementation features that you could recommend which incentivizes the poorer population to pick up the transfers, but does not incentivize the richer families? Do you have any global practices to share, any advice there? Because really these are implementation challenges. This is not a choice between two different kinds of arithmetic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My question is going to be a direct one. We are talking about universal child grants in this conference. And we've just seen simulations there which could actually inform the design to a very large extent. But my question is about the extent of inclusiveness of these simulations. Do these simulations include disability? Do they mainstream disability? Are they mainstreaming children with disability? And if not, would the picture change? And again, if not, are we still talking about universalism of child grants? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Usman. I'm working for UNICEF Kenya. I think I would write a little bit on the previous speaker, bringing the debate to the African context, where sometimes you will see that we have high fertility rates, and even the population per household is sometimes very high. I can just take the case of Kenya. We have 51% of population, which is children population, which is quite similar to Madagascar's context. So, and also in a context whereby, I think as my colleague Usha said, the fiscal space of government is very narrow. So I would be very much interested to hear more about like what are some specificities of this context in the context of UCG. Governments are ready to implement, but I see they are always, challenged by the question of, do we have enough resources? Or even if we go to implement such programs, the inclusiveness, I think yesterday one World Bank staff was saying it like it is targeting among the children. So when we say like universal child grants, maybe Kenya can afford a UCG of 0 to 2. What about others? So I think maybe these are some other questions. I really appreciate the very good work that has been done in several countries, but I think we still need to dig more on those evidences, particularly when we go back, how we can convince our government to move towards the UCG. Thank you very much.
Yes, I think we'll take the first round, and if you have more questions, we'll come to you again. And I think all these questions, all of you can answer these questions, so I will just, you go by and then.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. My first answer is, it is arithmetic, but arithmetic is important because, very often we have this discussion based on principle, and when some of these options cost 6–7% of GDP, as you mentioned, fiscal space is reduced, maybe you should start thinking about alternatives. So I think we need to have a sense first on how much option costs. There is not a single option we should put on the table. We should find a compromise between the fiscal space and the reality on the ground and how best we can use limited resources. And I think that's where strategic planning of social protection is important, and that's where I think it moves beyond your own opinion, and really it's about helping who we can. For instance, yes, there are, I mean, public works is a clear example that you can self-select people into some programs without a PMT. So there are various ways you could increase the burden of registering, and then you suddenly would see people who don't find it worth doing and others who does. There are ways to, I'm not saying all of them are good, but there are ways to tailor programs, and I think that's to me what makes social protection challenging, but also interesting, is because you really need to understand the context to design the best program given the context. On disability and other grants, that's where we see, I think we are converging, at least internally, into a position where we are for universalism, but that doesn't mean we are for a single program. You have different populations with different needs, and at a certain point you may want to have a basis, a universal basis, if you can afford. That's actually, I mean, feasible. You can, as we said, you can start targeting through taxation in countries where taxation systems cover a large proportion of the population. But eventually, if we would move towards a single program, it would be a little bit like dismantling the welfare state, which is based on giving people also according to their vulnerabilities. So universalism, yes, but that doesn't mean one program.
Martin, over to you.
Okay, Usha, yeah, arithmetic. I mean, I think we actually have to make the arithmetic better. One of the things I couldn't include was how much churn you get through indirect taxes once you start spreading cash transfers across the distribution. So some of that you will collect back in sales tax, VAT, etc. But also, I mean, what's different about low-income and middle-income countries is that we really need to understand what the second-order effects are, because we know that once you give a household transfers, it doesn't actually change that dollar for dollar into consumption. There's, you know, I think the Colin Andrews meta-analysis shows about 0.7. But households will share their greater income with other households. They will pay back debt. They will make savings. So I think even in the crude arithmetic, we have to go better. But your other point about the poverty line being so sensitive in where it is in the distribution is very, very well taken. I think trying to use a regression approach to accurately measure people's correlates to a line which is inherently sensitive is just not particularly robust, which is why I said that I would target the bottom 40%, knowing that that's significantly above the poverty line in all of the countries I looked at. I don't call that inclusion error, I call that safe distance and tolerance levels. In terms of disability, yes, I didn't have the data to look at disability. I think it's hugely important. I will, however, say that accurately identifying disability across the range of disabilities that exist is very difficult. Very often people with cognitive or learning difficulties get left out of discussions or left out of identification. The other thing I'll say is a lot of the problems of exclusion error for benefits for disabled people are nothing to do with the means test or other things. They're about the problems of access and the costs of access, which are disproportionately higher for people with disabilities. So I think encouraging coverage of children and people with disabilities needs a fundamental rethink in terms of how we organise services and cash benefits together and how we reach out. Usman, I have one thing to say. Come to my talk this afternoon, which I'll also spread that invitation to others. Yes, having worked on the paper I presented here, I began to niggle away at the issues of taking that forward into countries with different demographics, sub-Saharan Africa being the example. So I tried to repeat it for Ghana and found a whole range of new considerations that I think are really important. So yes, I think getting universal cash transfers to populations where poverty is measured through consumption, where child fertility is high, where large household size influences outcomes is hugely important. That's my plug.
Eszter, I don't know if you want to, and so actually you go. Okay, Eszter and then me.
I would like to respond to Usman's comment. So Usman, sorry, I have read the social protection sector investment plan in Kenya, and that actually, if I remember correctly, envisions a universal child grant for all children until the age of 3, of about 700 shillings, if I remember correctly, and a gradual expansion. Now, I remember when I read that, I was wondering to what extent is there government ownership and commitment behind this investment plan. And I think that is a very important point. You asked, how can we convince the government to invest in children? I think we can advise them, and we can show them the evidence. I know that UNICEF is doing quite some work on this. Actually, we are working for UNICEF in Kenya, working on an investment plan for social protection scale-up. So I think the best you can do is educate, so to speak, the public and policymakers, but ultimately it will have to be the Kenyan people and the Kenyan government deciding. And it's important to have government ownership for these investment plans and various strategic plans to actually materialize.
You may not tell from my name, but I'm half Swedish. And my grandma, who lived in Stockholm, spent a few years in a hospital. And the budget of that hospital was 3 times larger than what an average low-income country spends on social protection. So that's a reality of having very few resources, huge needs, as you rightly said. And what we're doing here is a discussion on somewhat where to start from, how to improve, what are the options, and trying to combine what is an open heart with the facts. And simulations are part of the evidence base. They're definitely not the sole way of doing so. So you'd be also happy to hear from us that the work that we're doing will include a heavy design component. But it's still, I think, an important part of the equation. And just understanding the relationships between who you give, how much, how far can you go, what implications are there system-wide. It's just part, I think, of our duty to have an informed debate about these issues.
Great, thank you. Any more questions from the audience? We have 7 more minutes.
There's one.
There is.
Or maybe an answer.
Yeah.
If nobody else is speaking, maybe I can just take 30 seconds. Just to go back to the public works issue now, obviously there is a huge experience and varied experience in public works across the world, bad and good both. Generally bad because it's seen as waste of resources. There is elite capture of public works still happening in many parts of India, so there's a huge debate around public works. Also, people forget that public works substitutes income rather than supplements it many a time. And incidentally, you're talking about extreme unemployment where people don't have any other work and public works is the only option. So there are a lot of questions out there, the impact on children, mothers working in public works, and all that stuff is there. I go back to what Hugo was saying. I completely agree that, you're presenting options, so well done there. And I think I'm looking forward to reading your book. But what I was trying to say is that there must be a way out in design features which actually makes it more difficult and more kind of a nuisance for richer people to apply for a universal program. So an example comes from India, for example, the LPG subsidy, and this was more of a public advocacy campaign where Prime Minister, whose fan I am not, but basically said, please relinquish your subsidy, and many people came forward and did that. So I was looking for adaptation in, say, registration and application and blah, blah, and all that stuff. Thank you.
Yes.
Since we don't have a lot of questions, I want to add my own question to the panelists as well. This is something that has been in my mind for a while. Do we have a sense of what are the poverty levels that we say the targeting is not useful? Let's go universal. For example, if a country has what you mentioned, 80 to 90% or 70 to 80% of population is either poor or very near poor, they can go, it's a transient poverty, they can go into poverty any time. Do we have evidence or do we know examples, or does it make more sense to just go universal because of the errors in targeting, the cost of targeting, the management and all those issues related to it? And I think we'll just take one more question and then Hugo, you can start with answers.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for giving me again the floor just to add some more. And Martin, yes, I promise I will come to your discussion this afternoon. But regarding the political will, I think the investment plan of Kenya has been fully owned, even led by government. But it's it is still in the policy reflection. So right now we have now our feet on the ground, like designing it, and that's where now we are finding the difficulties. And I think I was very much interested by the presentation that was being made by Kyrgyzstan, and I think where now we are seeing now the challenges. It's not just the categories like from 0 to 2, 0 to 5, but even if when you are in a countries with very big populations, high fertility rate, even a small, like you take a very small proportion of the categories can be very high in terms of impact on the budget. And I think, as you know, also most of these countries, so I bring this also for sharing, when you take this, most of these countries, the fiscal space, of course, is not large, but even, the tax system is not very important or very developed, like when you take developed countries like UKs or some upper middle income countries. So governments, they have somehow challenges, to increase the tax system, but also, of course, some countries have mineral resources here and there, but usually they come also to fit some other gaps like infrastructure and others. So I think this is something that we are very much interested as we are now in the proper design of UCG of Kenya. And I think whatever country has already faced these issues, we would very much be interested to share. Thank you very much.
So that was the last question. We have 4 minutes, so 1 minute each to presenter to answer the question. So Hugo, you can start. We can go in the reverse order.
Okay. On your question on what you're asking essentially is almost an affluence test, almost targeting from the top. We have 4 representatives from the government of Iran here, the third row. I think they can speak very well about their experience in 2011 on how they did it and what kind of challenges they encountered. And they're still maintaining a very high coverage program in place. We documented that experience, and I think in part is also reflected in the conference booklet, but they're here, and I think they would be better positioned to talk about it. Again, universality, going back to your question, is something that we need to think at system level. I think we are often stuck in a discussion on what that specific cash transfer program does or does not. Well, we need to think of how the whole population can be covered by either combining different interventions in social assistance, or what is the optimal combination of different forms of assistance and insurance according to context. That, in my mind, is a better framing of a question than a given threshold. And again, we need to take into account the tax side of the equation. Let's remember the number of, especially in low-income countries, those towards the bottom end of the distribution are net taxpayers. and that sometimes even with transfers, they're still net taxpayers. So we do need to have this system-wide look when we talk about universality, not just focusing on a given intervention.
I think, Usman, the issues you mentioned, they are the classical trade-offs and challenges with social protection programming. I'm afraid I will not be able to give a clear answer, but I think me and my colleagues would be very interested in discussing this with you and your colleagues in the future. Yeah, Kenya is a very specific context, that's for sure. There are regions where nearly everybody lives in extreme poverty, and then there's the capital, Nairobi, where the poverty rate is much, much smaller. Mm-hmm. It's also important, I think, that poverty in a country like Kenya means something completely different than it does in Kyrgyzstan or in wealthier countries. So I think long discussions will have to be held about this to maybe find an innovative solution that works for the country of Kenya.
Gosh, okay. In terms of sort of universality as an answer, I think it's important to realize that categorical targeting has exclusion errors as well. 70% take-up of social pensions, or thereabouts, 70 to 80% pension in Nepal, for instance. In terms of withdrawing subsidies from the rich, I'm a big fan of what's called fiscal drag, which is letting inflation over time withdraw the value of what they're getting. The problem is that you then need to front load the investment in social protection because your gains from fiscal drag take a long time to come through. World Bank, please note. Thirdly, high poverty levels. Yeah, I just don't know the answer, because the countries with high poverty levels also don't spend much on other areas of extremely important social expenditure. I mean, if you're talking about 1% of GDP going to a universal child transfer in a country where the government only spends 1.4% of GDP on health, then I worry very much about the opportunity costs as well as the distributional impact. And in terms of reaching individual children, if that's our target, then certainly services like education and primary health care will reach those individuals in a way which maybe combined or separate from cash transfers would be a better insurance against overall well-being.
Thank you. I would like to second what Ugo said, and wasn't advocating for any particular program. I was just mentioning ways one could, from excluding the very rich, going down to really including only the very poor. Now, and I think that relates to your questions. The problem, what we observe is the poorer the country, the more costly it is in terms of GDP to finance universality. So you have this paradox where the more poor people you have, the more costly it would be to actually assist them. So in a sense, I think now you have the solution may be trying to have programs where, yes, you're going to lose people because you can't have perfect targeting, but try to be sure that the extreme poor, the poorest of the poor, at least are more disproportionately covered. You cover at least more of them than the others, and slowly build up. I think it's difficult to move straight away to universality.
Fantastic. Thank you, all the panelists. And I think that brings us to the end of the session. Thank you once again.